Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
City and county budgets, an offer for the Germantown schools, and it's Memphis in May. Those stories and more tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined tonight by Burnell Smith, publisher, New Tri-State Defender. Thanks for being here again.
Glad to be here.
And Bill Dries, senior reporter with the Memphis Daily News. Well, Bill, I'll start with you. It is budget season. We have we talked a bit about the budget last week. We talked more about the IMPROVE Act and the impact that the state changes had and how that rolls down to the local level. But let's start with the county budget. It's a $1.2 billion budget. What's in it and what's the direction for the county?
What's in it is not a property tax hike and not a property tax rollback, which several of the county commissioners who have been talking about this for several budget seasons are making some more noise about possibly calling for. Maybe a cent, maybe I've heard up to 5-cent rollback once we get the recertified property tax rate. And in talking with Mark Luttrell, the Shelby County mayor, about his budget proposal, he made a strong defense for keeping the rate where it is. He says that the county needs to keep the rate right where it is, keep the finances flowing, even though at this point the county has its debt under $1 billion. It probably won't stay there for very long. Right. But the debt is under there because the debt plan has worked. So now what you're seeing in the internal workings of the budget and how it's financed is that some sources of revenue are moving to other things, other purposes that keep the county's financial machine running.
On the debt, I mean, I think that it hit a high of, $1.8 billion. Wharton, when he was county mayor, former mayor A.C. Wharton, put a plan in place, got it down under $1 billion. Harvey Kennedy, the finance director,
chief administrative
officer at the county, has said, look, it's probably going to go up because of schools, in part, Burnell. Schools have big requests. They have a lot of deferred maintenance. The county is funding, obviously, the suburban schools and the big Shelby County school system. So it's interesting. I mean, there are a couple of points. One, the schools requests, and especially on the capital side, but also the fact that you've got a Republican county mayor, Mark Luttrell, who's been on this show years ago, said, look, I never signed a no tax increase pledge. I never signed. I mean, he's not going to get consumed with cutting taxes for cutting taxes state.
Yeah, I don't think so. And one of the points that both he and Harvey Kennedy made is making sure that they manage the cash flow and the reserve properly. And so, to roll the taxes back, it may look like it's a good time to do it, but based on the ebbs and flows of collections, that might be a challenge. And then also looking at the fact that there are requests to build some new schools. There's a ton of deferred maintenance that's got to be done on existing buildings. Of course, schools are the huge,
$450 million, is that right, Bill? Give or take, exactly. Almost half of the,
almost half of the budget. Right. So, I think they're trying to really manage this process smartly. Although, across both in the state and in the county-wise, there's surplus and things look good now, but the ebbs and flows could create some issues, and I think it's smart to be fiscally conservative.
And again, we've talked about on the show recently, we had the trustee and the assessor on bill. Residential properties on average up 13% across the county. The commercial properties up as much as 20%. So there'll be an adjustment down in the tax rate just because of the way that works. Right. But again, you've got elected officials saying, look, let's cut it further if we've got this much cash.
And you've essentially got two things that are in play here. One is you have an administration among administrations who are extremely nervous about what the next economic downturn is going to look like, given the fact that we've just been through the worst one since the Great Depression. Right. So there are those kind of jitters. And the other thing is the school's capital needs for all of the schools, all 7 of the systems, because this money is distributed based on daily attendance. And with the historic changes we saw in public education, a merger to a demerger and other changes in it, during that period, you really didn't see that much in terms of capital request from Shelby County Schools, because there was a holding pattern and there was this thought of, okay, have the changes stopped? Can we now start to kind of look at the needs of a stable school system?
Well, yeah, well, I think that also, reflects those changes in terms of the recent negotiations between Germantown and Shelby County Schools. You got a $25 million offer to purchase the 3 schools.
Germantown Elementary, Germantown Middle School, Germantown High School. That people who got lost, and I can't blame them, in the shuffle of schools over the last few years. They were Germantown suburban schools that Shelby County school system held on to. The only suburban schools, I believe.
No, Lucy Elementary in Millington.
In Millington, thank you, Bill. But go ahead.
Yeah, but I mean, and so I think at the time they because of the high demand and high population in that southeast corridor of the county, Shelby County Schools smartly said, "Hey, we're going to hold on to these. Whether this offer is accepted, whether it's accepted in part or countered in some kind of way, it does reflect sort of the ongoing right sizing, if you will, of all the districts, including Shelby County, but the municipal districts as well."
Well, it also reflects the rising property values and the better economy, right? I mean, the original offer, didn't Germantown offer, Bill, what, $5 million was the first offer?
Yeah, it was $5 million for 2, the elementary and the middle school, because for the Germantown school system, that's where their student bulge is at the moment, in the elementary going into the middle schools there. So what Germantown's school district has is essentially a dual track that they've been pursuing. That's why you have a May 22nd deadline that the Germantown folks have put on their offer to Shelby County Schools, because that's when they have to fish or cut bait on the contract that they have on the land for a new elementary school.
Germantown would build for itself within its own school system.
And so it would either be that new school for 750 students, or it would be buying Germantown Elementary, Middle, and High School from Shelby County Schools, or possibly some combination of that.
Did we get any reaction from the school board or for Dorsey Hobson, the Shelby County superintendent?
Yes, I talked to him yesterday. He said that first of all, his phone started ringing as soon as word of the offer came, and he got a lot of calls from parents of students who are currently there who said, "What happens to my child in those schools next school year?" And he explained to them that if, and it's a big if this happens, it would be phased in over several years, and there would probably be some guarantees there that those students finish out their time at that particular school. But his reaction is, it's up to the Shelby County Schools Board to weigh this. They will take it up and they will decide. But he says the facilities are fine there. It meets the school system's needs at this point. And so he said on his side of the equation, their priority is what's best for the students and what's best for Southeast Memphis, where you've had this shift in school-age population out of the West and into the East.
Which is a far cry from an outright rejection, right? I mean, if you read the politics of it, where, so on. But the other part, and Bill brought it up, and Dorsey Hobson, I guess, really brought it up, it does remind you that all these changes in these schools ultimately affects kids in the classroom and families. I mean, from it's amazing to think about, from charter schools, school closures, new operators, iZone,
voucher
proposals,
I mean, all of that. I mean, it is essentially since 2012, 2013, there's been just radical continued evolution and change of what public education looks like. Certainly in Memphis, Memphis has essentially been ground zero for most what you call education reform or changes, not only in the state, but really arguably across the country. When you look at some of the experimentation that has happened here, and it's had to be, even for me as a parent with school-age students, one who's in a charter school, that it's been a confusing landscape And you know, part of it is, I think what gets missed in all the talk about buildings and money is the impact on children and families. And I think that's the most important component.
Well, even the Tennessee Ready testing, which was just didn't go well. The whole Common Core, I was going to call it Common Cause, Common Core, which there was so much political pushback on that, and then almost rebranding of Common Core because the standards didn't change. Again, everybody's in the classroom, teachers are trying to teach, and I think sometimes even we on the show lose sight of that because we're talking about the big picture budgets and so on. Let's see, we talk about budgets and education, segue a little bit. We talked again last week about the city budget bill, but more the council has started to look at the mayor's proposed budget. And we had one council member say, look, let's pull out some of these expenses that do go towards education. I mean, they are responding to the call that went out, a week or two ago, of the city should start putting money into the Shelby County school system. Mayor, Mayor Strickland, and now the council are saying, look, it may not be direct funding to Shelby County schools, but we do more than you understand, or you're giving us credit for youth and education.
Right. There is city funding. Essentially, the argument is that may not go directly to schools and may not be on a continuing basis to schools, but that it does affect students with after-school programs at community centers, and the libraries in particular. So Patrice Robinson of the City Council said at the outset of this, what she noticed was a line item in the capital improvements budget that went to 2 schools in particular. And she said, wait a minute, we're getting hit with people being critical of us for not funding the schools. So let's just keep a running tally, and that they will, as this program airs, they're into the operating budget now and will be for about the next week or two. But she said, let's just keep a running tally of how much funding the city does put up that goes toward that end. And so I think we'll have more discussion about the concept that the city needs to step up and do more for local education.
You also go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think part of it is also the fear of the dreaded maintenance of effort notion. When they start to commit dollars specifically towards education or towards the school district, then there's a process by which then that gets sort of codified relative to what they have to continue to maintain. And I think the mayor and the council are careful about how they allocate dollars and not getting caught in that particular quagmire.
Right. It is also interesting to watch. You compare this budget season. Last year was pretty uneventful. This one, I mean, they're talking about things like this, which are very important, but there aren't the kind of crisis issues like the pension funding and the cuts to employee benefits, the cuts to employee, no raises and so on. Again, they're living with that. The mayor would like to get back to a police complement in the 2,400 range. But a lot of the discussion, it was interesting. It was small stuff. It was little stuff of how do you tweak the budget, which again reflects a lack of crisis and more, not that the city is flush with cash, but a little bit more flexibility.
Yeah, and what you have seen in kind of like toward the end of the capital budget discussion was you actually saw Berlin Boyd, the chairman of the council, talk several times on several line items about what he feels is a need to balance the city's priorities and not have so much spending on public safety, in particular on police, although police and fire combined constitute 65–70% of the spending in the budget, and police is the largest division by those standards in the city budget. So there's beginning to be some interesting pushback on that, and Boyd is basically making a brilliant at the basics argument, but with a very different criteria for what the basics are. He says the basics should be programs in the community centers and libraries, and not so skewed toward police.
And we should say Berlin Boyd, the current chairman of the Memphis City Council. The other thing that's in there is, and we'll kind of segue into a big rollout that the mayor's office did on a big pilot project for street reconfiguration downtown. People have seen some of this. There's some in the medical district where they really do. I mean, they are aesthetically a whole lot nicer. I mean, they're the bike lanes, which get to be controversial, and they kind of change the traffic. Some people really like them. Some people push back against them. Council apparently did not. Is that right, Bill? Push back against the bike lane money that was put into this budget. So that's kind of a transformation too from where we were some years ago. I remember Wharton talking about the pushback he would get on bike lanes.
Yeah.
And why is that a priority? It seems that is changing so much. It's not just bike lanes. It's also a symbol of what the city was on these lists of the least bikeable community, the least fit community, no exercise, no path. It's changed a lot, starting with Wharton and now into the Strickland administration.
Well, there are still some questions about all of this, but I think that's what happened. What has happened is you have enough critical mass and you have enough projects in the pipeline. This particular one is a pilot project that essentially establishes a bike and pedestrian corridor between FedEx Forum and the riverfront. And so what they're going to do is restripe some of those streets, Peabody Place, most notable on there, and create basically a more visible corridor for folks on foot and people who are on bicycles to get between those two areas. There is some city support for this, but it's also privately funded. It'll go for a year. At the end of a year, the city will see if it can pursue federal grant money to sustain it on a permanent basis if it works out. But it's like planters, it's barriers that protect the bike lanes, it's some urban art commissioned work. There's also just basically laying this out so that people can see it and it's more apparent.
Right, but it is interesting too. I mean, you think about this as just this kind of esoteric sort of thing that Eric is fixated on, because I do get fixated on these things. But it's no coincidence that some of that goes right around where ServiceMaster is moving its headquarters. And if you look at ServiceMaster moving its headquarters downtown, 700 to 1,000 people, high-tech jobs coming from the East Memphis because they wanted to be in an urban environment, to hire people, to hire young people. This is part of that. This is an economic, they will argue, and people who push for these things, that this is part and parcel of getting people like ServiceMaster to come to downtown with all those jobs and all that economic activity.
Sure, I think that, when you look at how some of this began under Wharton, there was funds from Bloomberg and those kind of things that helped to kind of usher it in. I think where people took issue is, you in some communities, outlying communities, not necessarily core downtown communities, you were putting bike lanes that didn't necessarily make sense, based on the traffic patterns, et cetera, in those communities. In this particular instance, when you talk about the core of downtown, talking about adding that many more people there, when you look at activities like Memphis in May, and the flow and how many people walk from different components of it, it makes sense to have an easier path from parts of downtown to the river, to make the river more accessible. And I think in this particular instance, that particular component makes a whole lot of sense.
Well, it goes even to, and I think you did this right on a bill, or I know we did on the River Play event, which is a part of Riverside that's been blocked off for kids. So I mean, you think of Memphis May, you think of the Barbecue Fest with a lot of adult activity. You think of Music Fest, a lot of adults having a lot of fun. This is a thing for kids, which hasn't always been part of this. And I've walked past it. It's remarkable to look down on what they've done right at what they call now Fourth Bluff. Right.
Yeah, I've got some photos. Actually, the young lady that does my event manager is working with them on that component, and she sent me photos, and the way they've painted the street, and there's a basketball goal there. There's seating. It's bright. It's colorful. It's engaging. I mean, I think it's a great. I mean, the Riverside Drive is going to be blocked off anyway. So why not use the expanse of it and have something more engaging for families and for kids.
Families, which is different than what Memphis May is sometimes.
Because if you think about this, if you're an adult with small children, you know that the music festival and the barbecue, not that they are pagan rituals, but
they've been known to become such.
But it's not something that you want to take small children to. But you might want to be in the general environment, and River Play seems to be a perfect place to do that on a manageable scale.
But, and it is also, and then I'll stop, but it really is interesting, and just to look at that from Fourth Bluff and see where, it is this weird transformation of the city. You think of the city and see it through a different lens. It gets back to the bike lanes, it gets back to the urban art, it gets back to Overton Square, and all that urban art that's kind of peppered through there. It's not just a district of restaurants, it's also kind of an experience of walking the street and so on. Well, stay downtown for a second and talk. We have not talked on the show about continued changes at Beale Street. And maybe I'll start with you, Bill. The council did what recently? And it's in the ongoing effort to get better management. I guess the goal of everyone, the one goal everyone shares is they want Beale Street to be more successful. How they get there, there are a whole lot of different opinions.
Well, I also think everybody agrees that the first step toward getting there is to hire some kind of management firm to run the street on a day-to-day basis, so that the city or whatever entity the city has is free to look at the long-term vision for the district, possibly expansion of the district. So at the end of 2015, the city, with the council's approval at that time, put in place the Beale Street Tourism Development Authority to do that. And earlier this year, just a few weeks ago, the council abolished that authority, which at the point that the council voted had still not hired a firm to manage the street after 2 rounds of request for proposals.
Right. And you all have strong feelings about this. You're a tenant too, but your take on where we are with
Well, I mean, there was a meeting on Monday of this week, which we reported on. It's in this week's edition of TSD. Where the mayor actually met with a group of, concerned parties, which includes the principals of 21 Beale Street, which was the entity that ultimately was sort of the last man standing at the end of those rounds of RFPs that were put out, as well as Lucille Catron, who runs the Beale Street Development Corporation, which was instrumental in the early redevelopment of Beale Street, and argues through her attorney, Larry Parrish, that they still maintain and have the master lease, which was essentially a 52-year lease that the city back then gave to them to ultimately be the entity to manage the leases and so forth. They originally had sub-leased or hired essentially Performer, which was run by John Elkerton to actually manage the day-to-day. And then of course that went away, and now there's a legal argument that Randall Catron, who was her husband, never signed off on the consent agreement that actually led to the the tourism authorities development. So they wanted to lay all the cards on the table in front of the mayor. They've done that. The mayor's heard their story. We asked for a comment from the mayor. The mayor basically said 2 things. One is that they intend to, within 60 days, to hire, if you will, a manager of the street. Whether that withstands the legal, the litigation that's there, I don't know. The other component that we spoke to is his ongoing commitment to minority business, and particularly African-American owned businesses. Right. We have a majority African-American entity in 21 Beale who's at the table, and whether he looks at that, I mean, they basically quoted their, the standard that, hey, we're committed to minority business growth and development. We've got a 30% increase in the last year. Hey, we're still going down that route.
And where is the Downtown Memphis Commission is where in this?
They are still currently the interim manager, if you will, and which was initially a 6-month appointment that's turned into a 3-year appointment, if you will. And so I think I think it's at the point where everybody involved, the city is going to have to really make some real long-term decisions about the ongoing development of the street and how it plays out.
Okay. Just a couple of minutes left here. We started to talk last week, and I mistimed it, but a bill that honored, some people would say, Nathan Bedford Forrest, a Civil War general and the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, and a very controversial figure, let's put it that way, was honored in what is generally considered kind of a routine part of the tail end of the legislative session. There's a lot of honoring, a lot of things that just go through. People
essentially a consent agenda where things are put that you just know that stuff is going to be clean. You don't necessarily have to read it, and so this particular representative who had put a bill on the table that got chewed up and spit out.
That was going to honor
that was going to honor Nathan Bedford Forrest, and all the nefarious aspects of his history, and I guess in his point argument, his evolution. With that got pushed out, and then ultimately he found a way to bury it under this consent agenda, and it got approved essentially unanimously. I think 90
and signed.
Right, and signed
by Beth Harwell.
And so now we're in the state of Tennessee. We're sitting in a place where you have someone like him who's being honored.
Yeah, and you had African American representatives of Antonio Parkinson from Memphis, very upset. You had white non-Memphian Republican House members who did not like it. They didn't like how it was done, and they did not like that it was under the table, that they maybe did not speak up as vociferously as some would like, but I don't think there were many people who were too happy about how this went down.
No, and one of the things that I heard from our state representatives and senators here in Memphis is that this was unprecedented, that basically legislators take each other's word for it, that these things are not controversial.
All right, we're almost out of time. A quick thing that was announced today, Louis Graham, some call him Louis Graham, editor of the Commercial Appeal, leaving. I've only gotten to know him a little bit, a really good guy and done great work for that paper of 38 years. So good luck to him as moves over to a new position at a new place. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for being here. Join us again next week. Good night.